My name is Rebecca Montgomery, and I own 12 of the highest-grossing restaurants across New England. Last Saturday night at the Ashford estate, my brother Jonathan stood up during our parents' 40th anniversary dinner and told a room full of 150 guests that I was a burden to the family, that I'd never contributed anything meaningful, and that maybe it was time I stopped showing up to events where successful people gathered. He said it while holding a champagne flute that cost more than my first car. He said it while wearing a watch I could see from 3 tables away. He said it like it was a kindness, like he was finally telling me a truth everyone else had been too polite to mention. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The room went silent in that specific way that only happens when cruelty lands in public and no one knows whether to look away or lean in closer. My sister Patricia nodded along like he was reciting scripture. My mother dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin but didn't say a word. My father stared at his plate like the pattern on the china held answers he desperately needed. And I just sat there at the far end of the table, the seat they'd given me near the kitchen doors where the staff kept walking past, and I smiled. I smiled because I'd already paid for everything. The 5-course meal with wine pairings. The imported flowers on every table. The string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner. The custom cake that cost $4,000 and had my parents' names written in edible gold leaf. I'd paid for all of it 3 weeks ago, and I'd done it anonymously through my company's event management division because I knew exactly what would happen if they knew the money came from me. They would have refused it. They would have said they didn't need my charity. They would have found a way to make even my generosity feel like proof of my inadequacy. So I stayed quiet and I waited because I knew what was coming next. The moment Jonathan finished his speech and sat down looking pleased with himself, the moment Patricia reached over to squeeze his hand in solidarity, the moment my father finally looked up and caught my eye with something that looked almost like pity, that was when Vincent, the event coordinator, walked into the room holding a leather portfolio. He walked straight to my parents at the head table, and I watched my mother's face shift from composed sympathy to confusion. Vincent leaned down and said something I couldn't hear from where I sat, but I knew exactly what it was. He was telling them the bill had already been settled. He was telling them who settled it. My mother's hand went to her throat. My father's fork clattered against his plate. Jonathan's head snapped toward me so fast I thought he might injure himself. And in that crystallized moment of recognition, 15 years of being invisible, 15 years of being dismissed, 15 years of building something they never bothered to notice, all of it came crashing down on them at once. Growing up in Riverside Heights meant understanding your place in the ecosystem, before you could even articulate what an ecosystem was. The Montgomery family had occupied the same colonial house on Ridgeview Drive for 4 generations, each one adding their own layer of achievement to the family legacy like sediment building up on a riverbed. My grandfather had been a federal judge. My grandmother had founded the Women's Auxiliary that still ran half the charity events in Fairfield County. My father built an investment firm that managed portfolios for 3 governors and more old money families than I could count. Success wasn't just expected in our house. It was assumed the way you assume the sun will rise or that water will be wet. It was the air we breathed, and if you couldn't breathe it naturally, if you needed help or showed weakness or pursued something that didn't fit the established pattern, then you were gently but firmly reminded that perhaps you weren't breathing correctly. Jonathan was born breathing correctly. He came out of the womb already looking like he belonged in a corporate headshot. Even as a kid, he had this way of sitting at the dinner table that looked like he was presiding over a board meeting. He played lacrosse because that's what Montgomery men did. He went to Choate because that's where Montgomery men went. He got his economics degree from Princeton and his MBA from Wharton because those were the boxes you checked when you were building the kind of resume that opened the right doors. And doors opened for him. They always did. He never had to knock. Meanwhile, I existed in the spaces between their expectations. I wasn't rebellious or dramatic. I didn't dye my hair or get tattoos or run away to join a commune. I was just quiet in a family that valued eloquence, uncertain in a family that prized confidence, and most damningly, I was interested in things that didn't translate into the kind of success they recognized. When I was 14, I started spending my allowance on cookbooks instead of clothes. I'd stay up late reading about French technique and Italian regional cuisine, about the chemistry of bread making and the art of knife skills. I'd sketch out restaurant concepts in notebooks I kept hidden under my mattress because I already knew what they'd say. Cooking wasn't serious. Cooking was something you did as a hobby or something other people did for you. It certainly wasn't something a Montgomery built a life around. Patricia, my older sister, had figured out early that the easiest path to acceptance was marriage. She'd found Thomas Whitman III at a regatta when she was 23, and by 24 she was planning a wedding that got written up in Connecticut Magazine. Thomas came from shipping money, the kind that was so old it had stopped being vulgar and started being historical. Patricia didn't need to achieve anything after that. She'd achieved the right last name, and that was enough. She moved into a house with more bathrooms than occupants and spent her days on charity boards where the primary qualification was knowing which fork to use. I should probably mention that I loved them. That's the part that made everything harder. They weren't monsters. They didn't beat me or lock me in closets or do any of the dramatically terrible things that would make this story simpler to tell. They were just extraordinarily good at making me feel like I was perpetually auditioning for a role I'd never quite land. Like I was the understudy who kept showing up even though everyone knew I'd never go on. The first time I remember really feeling it in my bones, was at Patricia's wedding. I was 16. They'd given me a role in the ceremony, bridesmaid number 4, fourth from the bride in a line of 6. My dress was lavender, and it fit wrong in a way that no amount of alterations could fix. Because the problem wasn't the dress. The problem was me inside it. During the reception, I spent most of the evening at the kids' table even though I was technically old enough to sit with the adults. Nobody had explicitly assigned me there. I just gravitated toward it because it felt more honest somehow. At least the children weren't pretending I belonged somewhere I didn't. I remember watching Jonathan give a toast that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure. I remember watching my father clap him on the back afterward with this look of unmistakable pride. And I remember thinking I will never make him look at me like that. Not because I couldn't, but because we were speaking different languages, and neither of us had a dictionary. After high school, I told them I wanted to take a gap year. What I meant was I wanted to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly being measured against a standard I'd never set for myself. What they heard was I wasn't ready for real life yet. My father sat me down in his study, the one with the leather chairs and the wall of law books that were more decorative than functional, and he said, "Rebecca, we love you, but we're worried you don't have direction." He said it kindly. That was what killed me. He wasn't angry. He was concerned. He was looking at me the way you'd look at a plant that wasn't thriving, trying to figure out if it needed more water or better soil or perhaps should just be moved to a different room where it wouldn't be so noticeable. I told him I wanted to work in restaurants. The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. Then my mother, who'd been standing in the doorway, said, "Do you mean manage them? Like hospitality management?" And I'd said, "No, I mean work in them. Cook. Learn the business from the ground up." My father had closed the folder he'd been holding. He did that sometimes when a conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. Closed folders, straightened papers, created little organizational rituals that gave him time to formulate responses. "Sweetheart," he'd finally said, "that's labor. That's not a career. That's what people do when they don't have options. You have options." I'd left his study without finishing the conversation because I already knew how it would end. They'd talk me into something reasonable. Business school, maybe. Or a position at my father's firm doing something administrative that could be dressed up to sound impressive at dinner parties. And I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd just been brave enough to disappoint them. So I made a decision that night. I would disappoint them, but I'd do it quietly. The apartment above Gino's family restaurant smelled like garlic and tomato sauce every minute of every day. A smell that seeped into my clothes and my hair and probably my DNA. It was a fourth-floor walk-up in the old part of Riverside Heights, the part where longtime residents still lived in buildings that hadn't been converted into luxury condos yet. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with 3 other tenants. The radiator clanked like it was trying to communicate in Morse code. The windows didn't quite close all the way, so in winter I could see my breath in the mornings. And it was mine. I'd found the job listing for Gino's on a community board at the library. Dishwasher and prep cook needed. No experience necessary. I'd walked in on a Tuesday afternoon when they were closed, knocked on the back door until someone answered, and met Marcus Webb for the first time. Marcus was 50-something, with hands that looked like they'd spent decades doing actual work and eyes that didn't miss much. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd inherited Geno's from his uncle 15 years earlier, and had kept it exactly the way it had always been. Red and white checkered tablecloths. Frank Sinatra on the speakers. A menu that hadn't changed since 1978. The food was good in that unfussy, honest way that kept neighborhood people coming back but would never get written up in glossy magazines. He'd looked at me for a long time before speaking, taking in my clothes which were probably too nice for a job interview at a place like this, my hands which had never held a professional knife, my posture which apparently screamed that I'd grown up in a house where someone else did the dishes. You running from something, he'd finally asked. Or running toward something. Toward, I'd said. He'd hired me on the spot. Told me to come in the next morning at 6. Told me to wear shoes I didn't mind ruining. Told me the work was hard and the pay was terrible, and if I was looking for glory I should probably keep walking. I showed up at 5:45. For the first 6 months I learned what tired really meant. The kind of tired that lives in your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever feel rested again. I washed dishes until my hands cracked and bled. I prepped vegetables until I could dice an onion in my sleep. I cleaned grease traps and scrubbed floors and took out trash that weighed almost as much as I did. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, I started learning. Marcus didn't teach the way my teachers at Choate had taught. He didn't explain theory or assign readings or give tests. He just showed me things once, expected me to remember, and corrected me when I got it wrong. He taught me that cooking wasn't about following recipes. It was about understanding ingredients, about knowing what heat does to proteins and how acid balances fat and why timing matters more than almost anything else. He taught me that running a restaurant wasn't romantic. It was logistics and math and psychology. It was managing inventory and controlling costs and understanding that every plate that left the kitchen was both a product and a promise. Most importantly, he taught me that the work itself was enough. That there was dignity in doing something well even if no one was watching. That mastery didn't require an audience. My family didn't know where I was. I told them I was taking a position with a small consulting firm, which was vague enough to be meaningless and boring enough that they didn't ask follow-up questions. I'd moved out of the house with 2 suitcases and a box of books, and I'd stopped attending family dinners. When they called, which wasn't often, I kept the conversations brief. Work was fine. I was fine. Everything was fine. Jonathan had started at our father's firm by then, and was already making the kind of money that turns people insufferable. Patricia was pregnant with her first child and spending most of her energy decorating a nursery that had been featured in a design blog. They were busy with their lives and I was easy to forget. On my 20th birthday, my mother sent a card with a check for $500 and a note that said, "Hope you're taking care of yourself." The check felt like a tip. I cashed it anyway and used it to buy a used copy of Escoffier's Le Guide Culinaire that I'd been eyeing at a bookstore downtown. At night, after 12-hour shifts that left me too tired to do anything but collapse, I'd sit on my bed with that book and read about the foundations of French cooking, about the systems and structures that could turn chaos into consistency. I started taking notes, not just about cooking but about business. I'd watch how Marcus ran Geno's, what worked and what didn't, where the inefficiencies were, how thin the profit margins ran. I started understanding that the restaurant business was brutal, that most places failed within the first year, that success required not just good food but good systems, good people and good timing. And I started thinking about what I would do differently if I ever got the chance. 2 years into working at Geno's, Marcus sat me down during a slow Tuesday lunch shift and said, "You're not going to stay here forever." It wasn't a question. I'd looked up from the prep work I was doing, surprised. He continued, "You're good. You've got the instincts for this. But you're learning everything you're going to learn from me. You need to go somewhere that'll push you harder." He'd written down an address on a napkin. Culinary Institute in Manhattan. "They've got a night program for people who need to work during the day. You should apply." I'd stared at that napkin for a long time. The thought of going back to school, even a different kind of school, felt like admitting I couldn't figure it out on my own. But Marcus had said, "Pride's expensive, Rebecca. Don't let it cost you your future." I'd applied the next week. Got accepted 6 weeks after that. For the next 3 years, I worked at Geno's from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, took the train into Manhattan, attended classes from 4 until 10 at night, and took the train back to collapse in my apartment that still smelled like garlic and tomatoes. I learned classical technique and modern innovation. I learned about food costs and labor percentages. I learned about marketing and concept development. And somewhere in those 3 years of sleeping 4 hours a night and running on coffee and stubborn determination, I stopped being someone who wanted to work in restaurants and became someone who understood how to build them. My family never asked what I was doing with my time. On the rare occasions I saw them at holidays or obligatory events, they'd make vague inquiries about my job, and I'd give vague answers, and we'd all move on to talking about Jonathan's latest promotion or Patricia's children or my parents' upcoming trip to somewhere expensive. I was wallpaper in my own family, present but not noticed, functional but not appreciated. And honestly, I preferred it that way, because what I was building for me. The graduation ceremony from the Culinary Institute happened on a Thursday evening in May, and I attended alone. Marcus had offered to come, but I told him the restaurant needed him more, which was true but also convenient. The truth was I didn't want anyone there. I didn't want to share that moment with witnesses who might dilute it with their own interpretations of what it meant. I sat in the back row of the auditorium in my rented cap and gown, surrounded by people whose families had shown up with flowers and cameras, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not sadness but clarity. This was mine. Every late night, every burned hand, every moment of doubt that I'd pushed through while my body screamed for rest. It all belonged to me in a way that nothing in my previous life ever had. When they called my name and I walked across that stage to accept a diploma that represented 3 years of the hardest work I'd ever done, I shook the dean's hand and looked out at the empty seats where my family should have been, and I felt free. I took the train back to Riverside Heights that night still wearing my graduation gown under my jacket, because I wanted to remember how it felt for just a little longer. When I got back to my apartment, I hung the diploma on the wall next to my bed, and then I opened my laptop and started writing a business plan. I'd been thinking about it for months, sketching ideas in the margins of notebooks and on napkins during slow moments at Gino's. The concept was simple on the surface but complex in execution. A restaurant that felt upscale but wasn't pretentious, that served food sophisticated enough to impress but approachable enough not to intimidate. A place where the wine list was carefully curated, but you could also just order a beer. Where the music was good and the lighting was warm and people felt like they could celebrate something important or just show up on a Tuesday because they didn't feel like cooking. I called it Provisions. The name felt right. Solid, unpretentious, suggestive of abundance without being showy. I spent the next 6 months refining every detail. Menu concepts, floor plans, cost projections, staffing models. I researched locations and studied demographics. I calculated how many covers we'd need per night to break even and how long it would take to become profitable if everything went exactly right, which it never does. The numbers were brutal. To open the kind of restaurant I was envisioning, I needed capital I didn't have. My savings from 3 years of living like a monk amounted to about $30,000, which was enough to maybe buy the kitchen equipment and not much else. I needed at least $200,000 to do it properly. Maybe more. I could have asked my family. My father had money. He'd probably have written a check just to prove he could, just to maintain his position as the person who solved problems with his wallet. But taking his money would have meant giving him ownership, not legally but psychologically. It would have meant every decision I made would be filtered through his approval. Every success would be attributed to his investment. Every failure would be proof that I should have listened to him in the first place. So I did what people do when they need money and don't have rich relatives they're willing to ask. I worked. I picked up extra shifts at Gino's. I took consulting gigs helping other restaurants streamline their operations. I taught weekend cooking classes out of a community center kitchen to people who wanted to learn how to make pasta from scratch. And I saved every dollar that didn't go directly to keeping myself alive. Took 2 years. 2 years of watching other restaurants open and succeed or fail, learning from both. 2 years of networking with suppliers and contractors and real estate agents, building relationships that would matter later. 2 years of waking up every single morning with the same thought. Not yet, but soon. When I finally had enough for a down payment and a realistic shot at a small business loan, I found a space in downtown Riverside Heights that had been sitting empty for 8 months. It was smaller than I'd originally envisioned, only 45 seats, but the bones were good. High ceilings, good light, a kitchen. That needed work but had potential. The rent was just barely within my budget if I was willing to live on nothing for the first year, which I was. The landlord was a man named Richard Chun who'd owned the building for 30 years and had seen a dozen restaurants fail in that exact space. He looked at my business plan with the expression of someone who'd heard every promise before. "You're young," he'd said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." "I'm experienced," I'd replied. "There's a difference between young and inexperienced." He'd studied me for a long moment, then said, "I'll give you a 2-year lease with an option to renew. But I want first and last month's rent plus security deposit up front. And if you're late on rent even once, we're done." I'd signed the lease that afternoon. Opening a restaurant is like childbirth, except it lasts for months and there's no epidural and the baby might die anyway. Every single day presented a new crisis that felt insurmountable until you mounted it, and then immediately faced the next one. The contractor I'd hired to renovate the kitchen found electrical problems that added $20,000 to the budget. The permits took twice as long as expected because of some Byzantine city ordinance that nobody had mentioned. My first choice for sous chef accepted another offer 2 weeks before we were supposed to open. The espresso machine I'd ordered arrived broken. The custom plates I'd designed came in the wrong color. The refrigeration unit died during the first heat wave of summer, taking $3,000 worth of inventory with it. There were days I sat on the floor of the empty dining room at 2 in the morning and genuinely wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. If maybe my father had been right and this was just labor dressed up as ambition. If maybe I should call him and admit defeat and take whatever job he'd offer me at his firm and spend the rest of my life wondering what if. But then I'd stand up, dust myself off and figure out the next problem. Because that's what you do when you've burned every bridge back to your old life. You build something new or you drown. Marcus came by almost every day during those months, usually bringing food because he'd correctly assumed I wasn't eating properly. He never offered unsolicited advice, but when I asked questions, his answers were always exactly what I needed to hear. One night about 3 weeks before we were supposed to open, when everything felt like it was falling apart simultaneously, he'd found me crying in the kitchen over a vendor invoice I couldn't pay. He'd sat down next to me on the floor and said, "You know what separates the restaurants that make it from the ones that don't? It's not the food. There's 1,000 places with good food. It's not even the money, though money helps. It's whether the person running it can take a punch and keep moving. You've taken about 40 punches in the last 6 months. You're still here. That means something." We opened on a Tuesday in September, which every person I consulted said was a terrible idea. You're supposed to open on a weekend when you can generate buzz and fill seats and create momentum. But I opened on a Tuesday because I wanted our first service to be manageable. I wanted my staff, most of whom I'd hired from other restaurants and cooking schools, to have a chance to find their rhythm without the pressure of a packed house judging their every move. We served 18 people that first night. I remember every single one of them. A couple celebrating an anniversary. A group of 4 who'd worked together at the hospital and wanted to try someplace new. 2 women who'd been friends since college and met for dinner once a month. A man eating alone at the bar who told me he'd been watching the space being renovated and was curious. The food wasn't perfect. The timing was off on a few dishes. One server dropped a wine glass. The music was slightly too loud until we adjusted it halfway through service. But people seemed happy. They seemed comfortable. And when they left, several of them said they'd be back. I stayed until 4 in the morning that night, going over every detail of the service, making notes about what to adjust, what to keep, what to completely reimagine. When I finally locked the door and walked out into the empty street, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief, not pride, just a quiet sense of rightness. Like I'd finally found the shape I was supposed to fit into. The first few months were exactly as hard as everyone had warned me they'd be. The reviews started coming in, mostly positive but with enough criticism to keep me awake at night. The local food blogger with 20,000 followers came in and wrote that the food was ambitious but occasionally inconsistent, which was fair and also devastating. We had nights where we were completely slammed and the kitchen fell apart, and I had to personally apologize to tables who'd been waiting too long. We had nights where only 12 people showed up and I had to send staff home early and wonder if we'd still be open next month. But slowly, incrementally, we found our footing. Regulars started appearing, people who came in once a week or once a month and knew the servers by name. The consistency improved as my kitchen staff learned to work together like an actual team instead of a collection of individuals. The word of mouth spread in that organic way that you can't manufacture, one satisfied customer telling their friends who told their friends. By the 6-month mark, we were profitable. Not wildly, not enough for me to stop having anxiety dreams about the rent, but enough to prove the concept worked. By the 1-year mark, we had a waiting list on weekends. And by the 18-month mark, I'd paid off my small business loan and started thinking about what came next. That's when Jonathan walked into Provisions for the first time. I was in the kitchen during dinner service expediting, which meant I was the one making sure every plate that left the kitchen met my standards. It was a Saturday night, we were fully booked, and I was in that state of controlled chaos that I'd come to love, where everything is moving fast and your brain is tracking 12 things simultaneously and there's no room for anything except the work directly in front of you. One of my servers, Amanda, came back and said, "Table 7 wants to speak to the owner." My first thought was complaint. Something was wrong with their food or their service or their experience, and they wanted to express their displeasure directly to the person in charge. I wiped my hands, smoothed my chef's coat, and walked out into the dining room. Jonathan was sitting at table 7 with a woman I didn't recognize. Beautiful, polished, wearing the kind of jewelry that whispers expensive instead of shouting it. They had half-finished entrees in front of them and wine glasses that needed refilling. When Jonathan saw me, his expression went through several distinct phases in rapid succession. Confusion, because his brain was trying to reconcile seeing his sister in a chef's coat in a restaurant he'd apparently chosen for a date. Recognition when the pieces finally clicked together. And then something that looked almost like embarrassment, though it passed so quickly I might have imagined it. "Becca," he'd said. "You work here." "I own here," I'd replied. The woman with him had looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "This is your sister?" she'd asked. Jonathan had nodded slowly, and I could see him recalibrating, trying to figure out what this meant and how it reflected on him. He'd recovered quickly, the way people who've spent their whole lives in rooms where perception matters learn to do. "Well," he'd said, forcing a smile. "This is unexpected. The food is excellent." "Thank you," I'd said. "I hope you're both enjoying your evening." I'd started to turn away, ready to get back to the kitchen where I had 40 other people's dinners to worry about, when he'd said, "Does Dad know about this?" I'd stopped, turned back. "Know about what?" "That you own a restaurant. That you've apparently been running a business while the rest of us thought you were, I don't know, figuring things out." He'd said it like an accusation. Like I'd been keeping a secret specifically to deceive him rather than simply living my life in a way that didn't require his awareness or approval. "I don't discuss my business with people who aren't invested in it," I'd said. Which was diplomatic enough to be polite and pointed enough to land. His date had looked uncomfortable, picking at her food and clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Jonathan had leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You should come to Sunday dinner," he'd said finally. "Mom asks about you." "She really doesn't," I thought but didn't say. Instead I just nodded and said, "I'll think about it." Then I'd gone back to the kitchen and pushed the entire interaction out of my mind because I had a restaurant to run and only so much bandwidth for family drama that I hadn't invited. But something had shifted in that moment. Some invisible line had been crossed. Because now they knew. Not everything, not the scope of what I'd built or the plans I had for expanding, but enough to be dangerous. Enough that I couldn't be invisible anymore. The Sunday dinner invitation didn't come from Jonathan. It came from my mother 3 days later. Her voice on my voicemail carefully pleasant in that way that suggested she'd rehearsed what she was going to say. "Rebecca, darling, your brother mentioned he ran into you at your restaurant, which is apparently quite successful, and we'd love to hear more about it. Why don't you come for dinner this Sunday? Around 6. Nothing formal, just family." I listened to the message twice, parsing each word for subtext. Your restaurant, not the restaurant, which meant she still wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Apparently quite successful, which was a hedge, a way of acknowledging something without fully committing to belief. Nothing formal, just family, which in Montgomery language meant formal enough that I should dress appropriately but not so formal that I could use it as an excuse not to come. I hadn't been to a family dinner in almost 2 years. The last one had been some holiday, Christmas or Thanksgiving, and I'd spent most of it fielding questions about when I was going to get serious about my career, As if the 60-hour weeks I was working didn't count as serious because they didn't come with a title they recognized. I'd left that dinner early, claiming a migraine, and hadn't been back since. But now they were curious. Now I'd become interesting in a way I hadn't been when I was just their disappointing youngest child. And I realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that this was a test. Not the kind they were administering consciously, but the kind that happens when someone who's been underestimated suddenly has to be reassessed. They wanted to see if I would come. They wanted to see if I would explain myself. They wanted to see if I would ask for their approval or their acknowledgement or their investment. They wanted to see if I was still the Rebecca they remembered or if I'd become someone else when they weren't paying attention. I called my mother back that evening after service, when the restaurant was closed and I was alone in the office doing paperwork. "I'll be there," I'd said. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," she'd said. And I could hear the relief in her voice that I'd accepted. Sunday at 6. I'd hung up and sat there for a long moment, staring at the wall where I'd hung the first review of Provisions, a glowing write-up from a food magazine that had called the restaurant a confident debut from a chef who understands that sophistication doesn't require pretension. Then I pulled out my laptop and checked my financials, something I did compulsively multiple times a day. Provisions was doing better than I'd projected. We were averaging 75 covers a night on weekends, 60 during the week. The profit margins were healthy. The staff turnover was low. The customer satisfaction scores were high. I had enough in the bank now to start seriously thinking about expansion. Not immediately, but soon. A second location, maybe. Something bigger, in a different neighborhood, with a different concept but the same underlying philosophy. I'd been having conversations with potential investors, people Marcus had connected me with, people who'd eaten at Provisions and seen something worth betting on. The plans were still loose, still theoretical, but they were there, waiting for the right moment to become real. And I realized that going to this dinner, subjecting myself to whatever judgment or interrogation my family was preparing, it wasn't about them. It was about me proving to myself that I could sit at their table as an equal, that I could withstand their scrutiny without flinching, that their approval or lack of it no longer had the power to define me. Sunday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Riverside Heights look like it had been specifically designed for a lifestyle magazine spread. I drove to my parents' house in the used Toyota I'd bought 3 years ago, parking on the street instead of in the circular driveway where Jonathan's Mercedes and Patricia's Range Rover sat like monuments to different kinds of success. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Brick facade, black shutters, perfectly manicured lawn. The kind of timeless New England elegance that required constant maintenance to appear effortless. I could see warm light in the windows and movement inside. And for just a moment I considered turning around and leaving. But I'd made it this far. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell instead of using my key, which I still technically had but which felt presumptuous after so much absence. My mother answered wearing a cashmere sweater set in pearl earrings, her version of casual. "Rebecca," she'd said, and pulled me into a hug that felt both genuine and performative. "Come in, everyone's in the living room." Everyone turned out to be exactly who I'd expected. My father in his armchair with a scotch, doing the crossword puzzle from that morning's newspaper. Jonathan on the sofa with his girlfriend from the restaurant, whose name I learned was Diane. Patricia and her husband Thomas with their 2 children, who I barely recognized because I'd missed so many birthdays and holidays. And Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother, who'd always been the odd one in the family, the one who'd chosen teaching over law and seemed genuinely happy about it. "Rebecca," my father had said, standing up to greet me with a kind of formal handshake he gave to business associates. "Jonathan tells us you've been busy." "That's one way to put it," I'd said. We'd settled into the kind of stilted conversation that happens when people who share DNA, but not much else, try to catch up on years of mutual neglect. Patricia talked about her children's school and the new addition they were building on their house. Thomas talked about his latest sailing trip. Diane, clearly uncomfortable being thrown into family dynamics she didn't understand, smiled politely and said very little. And through it all I could feel them watching me, waiting to see what I would say about Provisions, whether I would bring it up or wait for them to ask. I decided to make them ask. We were called to dinner around 7, and my mother had prepared the kind of meal she always did for family gatherings. Roast chicken, green beans, roasted potatoes, a salad with her signature vinaigrette. Competent, traditional, exactly what you'd expect. We sat around the dining room table that could seat 12 but felt cavernous with just 8 of us, and my mother served while we passed plates and made the kind of small talk that fills silence without meaning anything. It was Jonathan who finally broke. "So Becca," he'd said, reaching for more wine. "Tell us about this restaurant of yours. Provisions, right?" All eyes turned to me. This was the moment they'd been building toward all evening. I'd taken a sip of water, gathering my thoughts. "It's a contemporary American restaurant in downtown Riverside Heights," I'd said. "We opened about 2 years ago. We focus on seasonal ingredients and accessible fine dining. We're doing well." "Doing well how?" my father had asked. "Numbers-wise. Are you profitable?" "Yes," I'd said. "We turned profitable after 6 months. We're averaging about 70 covers a night now. Healthy margins, low overhead, strong customer retention." I'd watched something shift in his expression. Numbers he understood. Profitability he respected. This was a language he spoke. "And you own it outright?" he'd asked. "I have full ownership," I'd confirmed. "I financed it through a combination of personal savings and a small business loan that's already paid off." Patricia had set down her fork. "You paid off a business loan in 2 years? Most restaurants fail in the first year." "I'm not most restaurants," I'd said. There was a beat of silence. Then Uncle Frank had actually laughed and said, "Good for you, kid. About time someone in this family built something with their own hands instead of inheriting a client list." My father had shot him a look, but Frank had just shrugged and taken another bite of chicken. Jonathan had leaned forward, his competitive instincts clearly activated. "What's your revenue? Projected growth? Are you planning to expand?" I'd looked at him for a long moment, deciding how much to share. "We're exploring options for a second location," I'd said. "But I'm being careful. I'd rather grow sustainably than fast." "Smart," my father had said, nodding. "Too many people overextend and collapse under their own ambition." My mother had reached over and patted my hand. "We're so proud of you, darling. We just wish you'd told us sooner. We could have helped." The word helped hung in the air like smoke. I knew exactly what it meant. Money. Connections. The kind of assistance that came with strings and expectations, and the unspoken understanding that anything I achieved would be partially theirs by virtue of their investment. "I didn't need help," I'd said gently. "I needed to do it myself." Patricia had made a small sound, something between a scoff and a laugh. "That's very noble, Becca. But there's nothing wrong with accepting support from family." "I didn't say there was," I'd replied. "I just said I didn't need it." The rest of the dinner had proceeded with a subtle tension thrumming underneath the polite conversation. They'd asked more questions about the restaurant, about my menu, about my staff, about my plans. And I'd answered carefully, revealing enough to satisfy their curiosity but not so much that I felt exposed. When dessert came, my mother's famous apple pie that she'd been making the same way for 30 years, Patricia had said, almost casually, "You know, Mom and Dad's 40th anniversary is coming up. We're planning something at the Ashford estate. You should come." "Of course she'll come," my mother had said. "It's family." I'd agreed because refusing would have required an explanation I didn't want to give. And because some part of me, the part that still remembered being the girl who didn't get invited to things, wanted to be there. Wanted to prove that I belonged in that room with those people, even if belonging meant something different now than it had when I was younger. I'd left around 10, pleading an early morning at the restaurant, which was true. My mother had hugged me goodbye and made me promise not to be such a stranger. My father had shaken my hand again and said, "Keep up the good work." Jonathan had walked me out to my car. "Listen," he'd said when we were out of earshot of the house. "I know things have been weird between us. I know we haven't exactly been close. But what you've done with Provisions, it's impressive. Genuinely." "Thank you," I'd said, unsure where this was going. "I mean it," he'd continued. "And if you ever want to talk about expansion strategies or need an introduction to investors, I know people. I work with people who fund ventures like this all the time." I'd looked at him standing there in the driveway of our childhood home, and I'd seen him clearly maybe for the first time. He wasn't offering to help me. He was offering to help himself feel important, to position himself as the brother who'd connected his sister with the right people, who'd played a role in her success, who'd been there when it mattered. "I appreciate that," I'd said. "But I've got it covered." He'd nodded, looking slightly disappointed but trying to hide it. "Well, the offer stands." I'd driven back to my apartment that night, The same one above Gino's that I still hadn't left because it felt honest somehow. And I'd sat on my bed and thought about what had just happened. They'd recalibrated. That's what that dinner had been. A recalibration of who I was in their mental map of the family. Not a full acceptance, not a genuine reckoning with how badly they'd underestimated me for how long, but an acknowledgement that I'd done something they hadn't expected and now needed to account for. And I'd realized something important. Their acknowledgement didn't feel the way I'd once imagined it would. It didn't feel like vindication or victory. Felt like noise. Because the person whose approval actually mattered, the person I'd been trying to prove something to all along, was me. And I'd already won that argument. The invitation to my parents' 40th anniversary party arrived 6 weeks before the event, printed on heavy cream cardstock with elegant script that probably cost more per square inch than my first apartment's monthly rent. Eleanor and Robert Montgomery request the pleasure of your company as they celebrate 40 years of marriage. The Ashford Estate, Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. Black tie. RSVP by the 15th. I'd set it on my desk at the restaurant and looked at it periodically over the next few days, trying to decode what attending would mean. The rational part of my brain said it was just a party, a family obligation, a few hours of small talk and champagne, and then I could leave and get back to my actual life. But the part of me that had grown up in that family knew better. This wasn't just a party. This was a stage. And everyone who attended would be performing their role in the carefully constructed narrative of Montgomery family success. Patricia would bring her children who'd been coached to behave like tiny aristocrats. Jonathan would bring Diane and probably propose soon because that's what men like him did when they'd been dating someone appropriate for the acceptable amount of time. My parents would hold court like the benevolent rulers of a small kingdom, accepting congratulations and telling stories about their courtship that had been polished through decades of retelling, until they'd achieved a kind of mythological perfection. And I would be there as what exactly? The youngest daughter who'd finally made something of herself? The reformed disappointment? The one who'd shocked everyone by succeeding despite their complete lack of faith? I'd RSVP'd yes because not going would have been a statement I didn't want to make. Would have suggested I was still wounded, still angry, still seeking their approval by withholding my presence. Going suggested I'd moved past all of that. That I could sit at their table without needing anything from them. Whether that was actually true remained to be seen. In the weeks leading up to the party, Provisions hit a new milestone. A food critic from a major regional magazine came in unannounced on a Thursday night and wrote a review that used words like assured and sophisticated and destined for expansion. The review ran with photos of 3 of our signature dishes and a paragraph about me that mentioned my age and my lack of formal culinary pedigree, in a way that suggested both were assets rather than liabilities. Chef Montgomery, the review concluded, has created something rare in the modern dining landscape. A restaurant that feels both ambitious and welcoming, that respects tradition while embracing innovation, and that suggests this is only the beginning of a very promising career. The morning that review published, my phone didn't stop ringing. Reservation requests for the next 3 months. Interview requests from food bloggers and local news stations. And 2 separate calls from investors I'd been courting for the second location, both suddenly much more interested now that outside validation had confirmed what I'd been telling them. I'd hired a business manager by then, a woman named Lisa Torres who'd worked in restaurant finance for 15 years, and had the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from seeing every way things can go wrong. She'd sat in my office that afternoon going through the opportunities and said, "You need to be strategic here. This is your moment. The attention won't last forever. You need to leverage it now." I'd known she was right. Success in the restaurant industry was about momentum. You caught a wave and rode it as far as it would take you, or you watched it pass and spent years trying to catch the next one. So I'd started taking meetings. Serious meetings with serious people who had serious money to invest. I'd refined my pitch for the second location, which I was envisioning as a larger space, maybe 70 seats, in a neighborhood about 20 minutes away that was gentrifying rapidly. Different demographic, different price point, but the same underlying philosophy. One of the investors, a man named Gregory Palmer who owned a small portfolio of successful restaurants in Boston, had said, "I like what you've built with Provisions.